To kick off today's event, I'd like to welcome Regents Professor of Science Fiction Studies, Lisa Yazek. Welcome, Lisa.
I want to thank all of you for being here today. This is really exciting. And of course, I want to thank Catherine and everyone in the library for helping us to put together this celebration of 50 years of science fiction at Georgia Tech. And like I said, it's exciting that this is our first in-person event in almost 2 years, and what a great way to come back to it live. So thank you for all of you, both live and online, for being here with us today. So really quickly, just for those of you who don't know much about the history of science fiction at Georgia Tech, I am a science fiction historian. You are not getting out of here without at least a very tiny history lesson. My students are nodding. They know this already. Yep. So, but I'm going to keep it one paragraph, I promise. So we started science fiction studies in 1971 when my predecessor, Professor Irving Bud Foote, taught the first science fiction class at Georgia Tech. He was also teaching speed reading at the time. Those were the two things of the future, science fiction and speed reading, right? And he continued to teach those classes and to bring in science fiction authors like Fred Pohl and Ursula Le Guin and Kim Stanley Robinson. And then when he retired in 1998, I believe, he donated his own personal collection of 7,000 unique science fiction items to the Georgia Tech Library. And that became the basis of the Georgia Tech Science Fiction Collection. And we've been growing that collection ever since we got that donation. And today we have 17,000 unique science fiction items, and we are considered one of the top 20 science fiction research collections in the world. In this time, we've grown science fiction studies at Georgia Tech in some other ways as well. So just again, I promised I would keep it short. Today, we have at least 6 faculty teaching science fiction, fantasy, and horror across media in 2 different schools at Georgia Tech. We also have a science fiction minor for undergraduates, and we're developing science fiction courses for graduate students as well. We have a sci-fi lab where students from any discipline at any point in their careers can come in and do either science fiction research or production. And most excitingly, most recently, Professor Amanda Weiss, who's right back here behind us, just launched Hive Mind, which is an online science fiction magazine dedicated to the serious study and translation of science fiction from across the world. So in all this time we've been doing this, honestly, my favorite thing to do here has been the live events. And so I'm very excited that we're going to be doing this one here for you today. We've brought in authors, we've brought in film directors, we've brought in all kinds of artists, but this is the first time ever that we have brought in a space historian, science fiction author, and time traveler. And so without further ado, I give you Gideon Marcus.
Thanks, Mom. I would like everyone out there with your little pocket UNIVACs, pull them out and go to galacticjourney.org. That includes those of you who are in this room and those of you who are watching from the ether. You go there, you will see that we have recently put out an article just this morning, actually, on the latest book by Ursula K. Le Guin. And 2 days ago, we had an article on the latest Star Trek episode. The conceit of Galactic Journey is we are all time travelers living 55 years time shifted from you. We've been doing this since 1954. So if I seem a little jet lagged, that's because for you it's 11 a.m. and for me it's 1966. So from my unique perspective as a space historian and a time traveler, I heard this little talk just for you guys at Georgia Tech. And it is called What Science Fiction Got Wrong and Right and How You Make the Future. And I hope you enjoy it. Super secret sign. Okay. So what I'm not going to talk about today is why we don't have flying cars or personal helicopters or jetpacks or a future that looks like the Jetsons. I'm not going to be talking about why we don't have moon bases or space colonies, regardless of what various people in phallic-shaped spaceships would like us to believe is around the corner. That's for somebody else's talk. What I'm going to talk about is the doomsday predictions of the mid-20th century. So from the 40s through the 60s, well, it's what they call the golden and silver ages of science fiction, was really the boom where science fiction hand in hand with this idea that engineering and science will save the universe came forward with some really interesting predictions on how the world was going to end in the next dozen or 20 or 30 years. And we're going to be examining them and why they did or didn't come to pass. We didn't. So this first one I'm going to discuss is probably the one you will find most suffusing the science fiction of the day, the atomic bomb, first detonated in anger in 1945 and then held in reserve for the last, well, 70 years still and counting. So back then, a staple of science fiction was that we would destroy ourselves, and it was almost assumed that we were on this doomsday path. It was in the literature, whether it was On the Beach or Alas, Babylon. It was in the movies such as, it's in the popular articles of the day. So this was deemed that this could happen at any minute. The Soviets could bring in bombers and blow us up. So we saw it in movies such as the ridiculous Dr. Strangelove and its serious counterpart, Failsafe. And if you get a chance, how many people in this room have seen either of these movies? A lot of you have, some of you haven't. I strongly recommend them. They actually came out in the same year, and they're basically the straight and satirical versions of the same story. What if we had an accidental nuclear war? Something that was made inevitable by this overly complex, interrelated nuclear complex. And in fact, it almost happened. How many of you are familiar with the Cuban Missile Crisis? A lot of people. And those who aren't raising your hand, I'm wondering what they've taught you in high school. October 1962, we got the closest to nuclear war that we ever came and possibly ever would come, although 1983 we came closer than you might imagine. And the idea was that the Soviets put missiles in Cuba, and we found out about them with some photographic overflights, and we wanted them out. And the Soviets said no. And so we blockaded Cuba, and there were Soviet nuclear submarines in the area. And at one point, American destroyers were depth charging Soviet nuclear missile submarines. And at one point, they were about to turn a key and launch a missile towards Florida. And the only reason that didn't happen was one of the three people in charge of turning that key. They had a committee, captain and two other officers. One of them said no. That's how close we came, 1962. So obviously those prognosticators had something to what they were predicting. And even back then they were predicting that a cloud of radioactive gas would make the world completely uninhabitable. And this was before that there were thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons in everyone's arsenal, creating the potential for what they had to coin a term for, Megadeth, which was also an excellent heavy metal band from the 80s. So why didn't it happen? Well, that same event that got us close to the brink got us aware that there was a brink. And it got into the public consciousness that maybe we shouldn't be doing this. And also there was some public concern of things like the fact that they were detonating above ground tests in Nevada was causing strontium-90, a radioactive element, to build up in people's bones and potentially cause cancer down the road. So there was a growing environmental movement against this proliferation of nuclear testing and having these arsenals. So in 1963, Kennedy and Khrushchev signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And what this said was there will be no more testing of nuclear weapons above ground, in orbit, in the ocean. Still allowed below ground, because presumably that would be less environmentally taxing. And this set of satellites was called Vela, and it was designed to orbit the Earth and make sure no one was breaking this treaty. And the neat thing about this was seen as the first step towards ultimate disarmament, which interestingly enough was something the Soviets had been championing since the late 40s, where they had a bomb. But even after that, they paid lip service to that. Now, we'll talk about how far disarmament has gone. But in 1963, it was looking pretty rosy that we had actually dodged a bullet in terms of this particular catastrophe. Possibly the second most popular disaster to befall humanity, predicted in the 40s, 50s, and the 60s, was overpopulation. There were people who believed that by the year 2020, there might be as many as 4 billion people in the world, living shoulder to shoulder, eating dull yeast and perhaps each other. A book that has just come out from my perspective living in 1966 is Harry Harrison's Make Room, Make Room, which eventually became the Charlton Heston epic Soylent Green. Many of you have heard of either of those. Many people raising their hands, some not. So something for the curriculum. So with the advent of modern agriculture and life-saving technologies, the death rate plummeted. And if you look at a graph of population, it goes up exponentially. And so it was easy for a back-of-the-envelope mathematician to decide, if this go on, then by the year 2020, we will have exhausted our food supplies and we will be doomed as a society. And this was a huge, people were concerned about the potential for disease. People worried about the potential for losing living space, for environmental catastrophe. And it turns out they were wrong. They thought we were going to be living in giant arcology buildings. There'd be no room for individual dwellings. This would be the nicest of them. Mostly we'd be living in slums. People predicted a really dark society that Earth could not hold this many people. So there's a couple of things they missed, and we can forgive them for missing it because they didn't have Worldometer giving them minute-by-minute estimates of population showing where every person is born in every country in the world. In 1961, we reached the point of inflection in population growth. The second derivative of population growth went negative as opposed to being positive. And as a result, population kept growing, but the rate at which it grew and the acceleration of the rate started to decline. There are two things that caused this. One was, in 1961, the first birth control pill went on the market. Now, originally it was not marketed for birth control, but everyone knew that was one of the things you could do with it. And for the first time, women had control of their destinies. And I cannot underscore enough how important that was. The other thing is it was found that the richer a society got, the more leisure time they had, the more they wished to pursue their own interests, and having children wasn't as important. And so, get this. You can see a very clear flattening of the curve, phrase that might have use sometime in the future, right around the 1970s. And that's going to continue. Ultimately, the population of the planet is probably going to stabilize somewhere between 11 and 15 billion, which is still in the doomsday zone for the predictors, but not, interestingly enough, in the doomsday zone for the planet. Probably. And that's because we have learned a lot of coping mechanisms as a society. We've also learned that there's actually a lot more space. How many people have been to Japan? If you've been to Tokyo, it looks like the capital city in Star Wars, right? You can be in the middle of Tokyo and not see the edge of the cityscape. I don't know any other place on Earth that's like that. Maybe Mexico City is like that, but I've never been there. But if you go just an hour or two train ride out of the city, you've got boonies. As far as the eye can see, they have a name for it, the Inaka. Most of the Earth is like that. There's lots of places that is yet unsettled. Now, I'm not advocating for mass settlement because that's the recipe for environmental disaster. We'll talk about in a moment. But there's still a lot of space. So this is another catastrophe that did not come to pass. Hand in hand with overpopulation is the idea of automation and the idea that one day robots are going to take away our lives, or automation in general. This is the original concept of the robot, the idea that these are human-shaped, helpful beings with perhaps human-type brains. Also the idea that humans and robots would blend together and become indistinguishable, that there would be a regimentation of society and we'd all become ones and zeros. There's a character in the Peanuts cartoon whose name is Five. By the 60s, we knew that robots wouldn't look like people. We knew that they would look like this. Nevertheless, automation was here, and it looked like it was going to destroy our way of life, and everybody not only would be eating dole yeast because that would be all there was to eat, but that's all we could afford because we couldn't have jobs that would pay for anything better. One of my favorite science fiction stories is from the February 1959 If Worlds of Science Fiction. And the idea of the story, it's in a post-employment world, and nobody has jobs. Every once in a while, one in 500 people get a job. So we follow our hero who gets a job. It's amazing. He wins the lottery. He gets a job. And when he goes to the interview, they say, okay, here's your job. As you know, buildings are held together with bolts. And every once in a while, these bolts will come loose. And we need someone to go around the city every day and tighten the bolts and make sure the buildings don't fall apart. That is your important job. And the other thing is, it's very important you don't tell any of your friends you have this job because they're going to be jealous. And everyone's going to want this job. And the fact is, there's just not enough work for bolt tighteners in the city. So this guy's very excited, and he launches on his job with zeal. Have you read this story? Of course you have. Probably read more stories than I have. And so one day he has a dinner party and his best friend comes over, and his best friend is over the moon too because he got a job. And they're not supposed to tell each other, but they just can't resist. So the first one says to the second one, so you got a job? And he's like, yeah. He says, what's your job? He says, well, as you know, the buildings in the city are held together with bolts. And sometimes they get too tight. And my job is to go around every night and loosen the bolts on these buildings so they don't get too tight. So why didn't this make work, no real work society to pass? Well, anyone looking at graphs actually could have seen that we were already on a different path anyway. You'll notice that it used to be we all made our living farming. And in some parts of the world, that is still the primary economy of a country. But in the industrialized world, as of the 19th century, agriculture ceased to employ the majority of us. That got replaced with industry for a while, building things. But even by the end of the, I can't even say last century, century before last, there was another sector, the service industry. People distributing things, people serving people, people doing office work that surpassed even that. There's always been doomsday predictions whenever a new technology has come about. When the train was invented, people predicted we're gonna lose all the people who transport things in buggies. The Pony Express is going to be out of business. The railroad made millions of jobs because the infrastructure it created allowed cities to be built. There's the stuff that feeds the railroads, the people who build the railroad cars, the people who ship the stuff on railroads. The demand, it increases. You have a cycle. Every time you increase technology, even an automotive technology, it tends to create more jobs. And in fact, in the last 20 years, there's been what I call a fourth sector. That's the software as a service sector. There are whole industries designed for you to create your own presence on the internet. Whether it's a website creator or an email list. I used to run a software company that makes webinar software, that makes software hosting. So all we do is facilitate other services. And I imagine that cycle will continue. What I'm hoping, this is my naive prediction for the future, in 100 years, when we have such sufficiency all around the world, we'll have what I call the Etsy economy, where we're all just spending our time making artistic endeavors and selling them to each other, whether it's fan fiction or cool hoodies or whatever. That's my dream. Let me live it. Let me enjoy it. All right. And the other thing is, while it is true that automation takes away a lot of jobs, whether it's in the fields or in the factories, or even at your McDonald's, right? How many automated kiosks have we seen, especially with the recent pandemic? But one thing that robots have not been able to do, and I suspect they won't ever be able to do, is replace human creativity, which is something that people believed for a long time. I don't think that's possible. And that's why I think the Etsy economy will come to pass, because the one thing we won't be able to get from a robot is the creative endeavor, creation. All right, let's talk about the environment. In the 40s and 50s, this is what Los Angeles looked like. It was a smoggy hellscape. Now it's just a hellscape. But back then, it was a smoggy hellscape. We were putting so much pollutants into the air and stuff you could actually see. And we believed not only would it make life not worth living, we'd all have to walk around with masks on, for instance, perhaps. We would be causing mass extinction events. Global warming was predicted in the 50s and earlier. And so one of the main canards of science fiction of this time was environmental catastrophe. Sometimes, there's always human-made, but sometimes it wasn't in a way people could predict. In 1969, this is a river in Ohio. This river caught fire. Some of you who are young may not realize that this is not supposed to happen. And that's how bad things had gotten. So the question is, why didn't this trend continue? Why weren't the doomsayers correct? LA on the left, LA on the right. As you can see, a big difference. Well, a few things happened. One, people wanted less smog. And it's hilarious how much the industry kept progress from happening. All of the automakers said, we cannot introduce catalytic converters into our cars. If you do that, you'll send profitability to the bottom. The price of cars will go way up. It cannot be done. And in California, often leading the way in such things, in 1965, they passed a law requiring catalytic converters to get rid of smog in your cars. And guess what? That year, all the automakers had models with catalytic converters. And they didn't cost any more than the other kind. Isn't that amazing? Maybe they were just lying to us. Also, 1969, you saw that river caught fire. 1970, there was a big oil spill off of Santa Barbara in California. That could certainly never happen again. And as a result, in 1970, Richard Nixon, among many of the good things he did, which tend to get lost among the many bad things he might have done, was the Environmental Protection Agency, which still exists to this day. And so as a result, we cleaned up the environment. Things are a lot better. We had a catastrophe. How many of you are aware of the ozone hole issue? Good, lots of raised hands on that one. Right? In the 80s, 20 years from now from me in one perspective, and 30 years from now for me from another perspective, the chlorofluorocarbons that were used widespread in lots of things, including refrigerators, were causing ozone depletion, which had the potential to fry the planet in radiation from the sun. And we mandated the banning of the use. And of course, at the time, people said, oh my God, if you do that, refrigerators will cost twice as much, and we can't do it. And of course, once we banned them, then we had environmentally safe refrigerators. So we fixed that. So I have a question to you. We've now seen 4 different dystopian futures that in the 50s, people were pretty sure were going to come to pass, and none of them did. Were they wrong? Were they stupid? A lot of people who give talks like this will then say, ha, 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 see, nobody can predict the future. It's a fool's game. Don't even try. Or worse, people back then were stupid and we're smarter now. Our predictions are good now. Well, there's actually a flip side to predicting the future, and predicting that science is going to cause problems. The other is predicting that science will fix problems. And especially in the 50s and 60s, we had this idea that in addition to science destroying the planet, science could also fix the planet. And we put a lot of emphasis on science education, partly in reaction to the Soviets putting a lot of emphasis on science education. This is actually a picture from 1965, my alma mater, Central Union High School in El Centro. Hi, Mr. Talley. And the reason why these doomsday scenarios didn't come to pass was not that people were stupid and not because we got lucky, but because we made concerted efforts in every single one of these cases to deter these futures from happening. And I'm going to get back to that point in a second. First, I want to talk about today, because my question to you is, did we really avert these catastrophes? Overpopulation is still an issue. Maybe not in this country, where the birth rate has gone down to about 1%. Maybe not in Japan or Europe, where the birth rate has actually gone negative. But Africa is still growing rapidly. India is still growing. China is having the issues that came with trying to curtail population growth and now is trying to encourage it again. And even if our population does stabilize at 11 to 15 billion, we are currently experiencing the worst of the Holocene extinction. We've talked about Permian extinction, the Cretaceous extinction, the one that killed all the dinosaurs. But we're in the middle of one right now. We've lost half of our biodiversity in just the last century, and it's only getting worse. Places like Brazil, where they're cutting down all of the rainforest. So is overpopulation no longer a problem? It still is. Is unemployment no longer a problem? Well, right now, we are in kind of a privileged situation. Unemployment was extremely low, and then even because of the recent unpleasantness, had unemployment. But people right now are actually resisting going back to work because they want a better work. But in fact, there's still a lot of people who have lost their jobs, do not have training to get other jobs. And these people are still out of work and still not enjoying life. They exist even if by and large unemployment is low. Yes, it's true there's less smog in Los Angeles. Yes, it's true that rivers no longer regularly catch fire. It's also true that the temperature of the planet continues to go up. In 1958, there was an article that Asimov wrote that talked about the temperature would go up a couple of degrees in 55 years. He was right. Of course, he was taking from the literature. He didn't pull that number out of anywhere, out of nowhere. And we have not taken great efforts to ensure that this coming catastrophe doesn't happen. Plus, as we have seen, administrations can turn on a dime, and places like the Environmental Protection Agency can have their oversight gutted such that they are no longer providing the protection they were intended to have. Finally, let's talk about nuclear destruction. Now, it's true the risk of nuclear annihilation is reduced. On the other hand, more countries have nuclear weapons than ever before, including recent combatants like India and Pakistan. Iran is always on the edge of it, and for a while, Iran was out of a deal to keep them from making weapons. Only one country in the world has ever voluntarily given up their weapons program, and it was only them because nobody knew about it until they gave it up, and that was South Africa. But beyond that, I suppose you're wondering why I've avoided the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the pandemic. So in the 50s and 60s, if you read the science fiction of the time, global pandemics do not figure prominently. You have occasional references to them, like Edgar Pangborn's The Judgment of Eve in 1965. But for the most part, we don't have global pandemics represented in the literature, and that's because vaccinations were the newest thing. And nobody believed that a disease could go out of control. And if a disease did get out of control, it was probably some sort of biological warfare or some kind of mistake. Brian Aldiss wrote a story a couple of years ago, 64, called Graybeard, in which some satellites in the upper orbit cause radiation, and everybody goes sterile. And what happens to our population after 50 years of no kids being born? But no one thought it would happen naturally. That kind of thing was actually a phenomenon of the 80s and 90s, where you get books like The Hot Zone and movies like Outbreak and David Gerrold's Couture series. And in the Couture series, that was actually an alien invasion, right? It wasn't even natural. But I bring it up here because, as we have seen, when we want to fight a pandemic, we can come up with a vaccine very quickly. And I notice everyone here, by the way, is wearing masks. Thank you for that. I understand here in Georgia that's optional. And I'm glad you've taken it to heart, the importance of wearing masks to keep the spread down. But as you know, in this country and in many others, a lot of people have decided to take a more laissez-faire attitude towards pandemic control. And as a result, the pandemic is still rampaging in its second year. The only thing that can stop the pandemic, and the only thing people in the 50s thought would stop a pandemic, is us. And therefore, I think a pandemic goes very well with this nuclear annihilation prediction. we're the ones who would cause our own extinction as a species. So, are we doomed? Were the science fiction writers actually right after all? We just hadn't waited long enough for the predictions to come true. So I want to say something about science fiction. Science fiction's job is not to predict the future. Science fiction's job is to present an entertaining story. This has always been the case. I'm a published science fiction author. I've written cautionary tales. I've written fun stories. My job, first and foremost, is not to warn the world. I'm not paid by the Rand Corporation to tell you what the risks are. That said, there are things you can do in science fiction that it's hard to do in regular literature, whether it's social parables or cautionary tales. The reason why we have avoided all of the dystopias that I've described so far is conscious effort, a feedback between prediction and remedy. And we still have the power to keep these predictions from coming to pass. The future is not set. The future is in our hands. And if there's anything you get from this talk and leave with it, it's that you have the power to make the future happen, to keep these doomsday predictions from happening. It is a constant effort. It requires vigilance. It requires training the future and giving them the skills to avoid these doomsday scenarios. And God willing, working together, we will. And this concludes the talk portion. Now, as you know, I live in 1966. I've been doing it for a long time. I'm also a professional space historian. I'm on the American Astronautical Society's History Committee. I work with a team of about 20 people. I can probably answer any question you have regarding this time, whether it's on this topic or anything in the 60s in general. So the next half hour, 40 minutes are given over to Q&A, whether from the students or from Dr. Lisa Yazik. So I hope you will take advantage of it. And afterwards, we have some books to sell you.
Yeah. So we'll be sitting here. Anyone live who wants to ask questions, great. And if you are playing along online, please know that you can indeed drop questions into the Q&A, and by the power of technology, I will get your questions and ask them. Right. Sure. So we've got a question from Jen Glass, and she's asking what was known about global climate change in 1966, right? Yeah.
Quite a lot. It was a little more theoretical than it is today, but like I said, and if you look on Galactic Journey, there's actually an article from December 24th, 1958 called Dreaming of a White Christmas, one of the very first articles we did. By the early 20th century, it was pretty easy to look at the carbon emissions of the time and say, we will eventually create some kind of greenhouse layer. By the 50s, this was an active prediction by a large number of scientists. It was not controlling how we did business at the time, but it's definitely something we knew about. The idea that climate change was something invented in the 90s by liberal activists is just not supported. We have known about it for more than 100 years.
So you said vaccines were the new thing. How were they being presented in stories of the time? Were they solving pandemics, or pandemics just not even part of how people thought things would go?
We had much worse pandemics back then. So obviously everyone's heard of the Spanish flu of 1918. But polio was just everywhere, and millions of kids were dying every year from it. We had a president, famously, who suffered from it. And when Jonas Salk created the polio vaccine, this was such a huge deal in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. This idea, the 60s were when they were unlocking the genetic code, and everyone just foresaw treatment for everything. There was not a question about whether you should have a vaccine or not. Everybody took the vaccine. Smallpox was eradicated from the globe by the 1970s. Smallpox only exists in chemical warfare laboratories now. I mean, that is just amazing when you think about it. And the idea that the paradigm has shifted so much in 55 years to where not being vaccinated is patriotic is such a privileged position to be in, and really quite alarming. But I'm sure our current day prognosticators are already writing a flood of science fiction stories about that, and hopefully we'll avoid that doomsday scenario.
I actually do know a science fiction writer who said that he has not been able to finish his novel over the last 2 years because every time he writes an ending, it happens, and then he has to rewrite the book. So, yeah, so it's been like that. So we got 2 questions from our electronic audience. So let's start with the first of these. In modern science fiction, like, say, Altered Carbon, there are all sorts of concerns about the way class interacts with technological abundance. Has that been a concern throughout science fiction?
To a degree, yes. The idea of science fiction being social commentary as beyond entertainment, and I'm speaking beyond, say, and Brave New World is pretty famous for being genetically classist, and that's from the 30s. But in terms of mainstream science fiction, we had just gotten out of the gee whiz problem-solving golden age of science fiction, where it was all about the technical problems. And it's not until the 50s and especially the 60s with the new wave that you start getting social issues. This idea of overpopulation and scarcity emphasizes the haves and the have-not populations. And so right around this time that the galactic journey is in, you're starting to see the real social consciousness science fiction that we're talking about, this concern that we're creating these tiers of society that are become rigid.
Okay, second question. What about politics? Would people from the 1950s have ever predicted the rise of political extremism, not just in the US, but globally?
People have this idea that we live in a unique time. You can draw a direct line from Barry Goldwater through Ronald Reagan, who, God help me, is about to become governor of California, to George W. Bush, to Donald Trump. If you read, there's a 1962, I think it's Britannica yearbook where they talk about the great ideas of the year, and they have Barry Goldwater has an article, and then Jacob Javits has an article. Jacob Javits is the progressive. And Barry Goldwater's article reads like Trump's platform. It's nativist and regressive. I mean, you have to remember, in the mid-'60s, we had just come off of 20 years of political gridlock. Immigration hadn't been reformed. Social services hadn't been reformed. Nothing had changed since World War II. And that's because neither side in Congress had a majority to get anything done. And the reason why there was sweeping legislature in 1964 and 65 and came to an end in 66, by the way, is because for a brief shining moments, Democrats had a supermajority in the House and the Senate and had the White House. Right now, both sides are on razor's edge majorities, one way or the other. And so nothing's getting done, and you have this hyperpartisanism. But it's always been like this, and it takes an extraordinary event for that to change. The only reason that some of us felt like something might change is we had President Obama for 8 years, so we felt like we were in this liberal bubble. But the thing is, the way conservatism works is when nothing is changing, conservatism is fine, and their job is preserve the status quo. When things start to change, conservatism becomes reactionaryism. They want to go back. They want to make America great again. But this has always existed. In the 40s, it was the Dixiecrats. I joke that when people say, oh, it's the Democrats who were leading the charge against civil rights, and I say, yeah, the Democratic Party got so liberal, Strom Thurmond had to leave. All right. So a question on how racial dynamics, divisions, were represented both in science fiction and politics. Science fiction is where equality happened first. So in the 50s, the big canard of science fiction racial equality was you would have a starship crew and with all kinds of diverse people with names like Kowalski and Giuseppe and Cohen and other Jewish names like Seamus McManus or something. And in the 60s, you started having women appear in science fiction. We're watching Star Trek, as it comes out. And by the way, people are invited to join us. We watch it as it comes out at their appointed time with period commercials. It's a great experience. Message me and I can tell you how you. It's a private party. Don't sue us, Paramount. When Lieutenant Uhura appears on the bridge of the Enterprise, it's not that just that she's a black woman, which is amazing, but that she's a woman on the bridge of the Enterprise, clearly in line to command. In the very first episode, she's driving the ship. And a woman would not have her own starship-sized ship in the United States Navy until 1990. So science fiction predicts things first, and then there's about a 10 to 20 year lag time. 1964 is the very first time I saw a queer couple portrayed positively in a science fiction novel, and that's Tom Purdum's I Want the Stars, available from Journey Press. We have this idea, everything gets telescoped from our modern perspective. We have this idea that things were bad, and there were dogs biting people and fire hoses and segregation and Plessy versus Ferguson. And then all of a sudden, Martin Luther King got locked up in jail, and there was a march on Washington in '63, and Kennedy got shot. Johnson came in, and suddenly we had civil rights, and everything's better now. And that's not how it happened. It started a long way before. Civil rights started a long way before and kept going a long way after. In 1966, after all of these laws have been passed to enshrine the rights of black people to go to the schools they want, to vote for the people they want, there are crowds of hundreds of angry white people throwing rocks at children in the South and in the North, in places like Chicago. This is happening in '66. When you see the very fine people on both sides marching in 2020, that's not a new thing. That is a continuation of a trend we've had for decades, which never went away and only was allowed, it was made fashionable again for a short time. Hopefully, it's gone back underground.
All right, we have questions flying in from the digital audience here. Great. Whoa, in fact, they just lost track.
I'm here all week. Try the veal.
We may be. Yes. Okay. So, third question from the digital audience: what technology predicted by sci-fi should be our current focus?
It's interesting to look at predictions of sci-fi. Sometimes they're self-fulfilling prophecies. A lot of the things we saw in Star Trek, whether it was self-opening doors or wireless medical scanners or flip phones, were things that we pursued because we saw them in Star Trek and wanted to see them in reality. That said, one of my prized possessions is a big set of books. It's this big, and it's nothing but predictions by folks at the Space Technology Laboratories. Now it's TRW, now it's Northrop Grumman in LA, called Probe. And they asked a bunch of pointy-headed people, what things do we expect to see in the future, and what's the desirability of them occurring, and what is the likelihood of them? And what I found so fascinating about visiting things was not how many of them came true and which ones didn't, but how many of the predictions they didn't even make because they didn't know to make them. There are whole systems of technology that exist today that we wouldn't have even thought about back then. They just invented time-sharing computers back then, but everyone was still thinking in terms of everyone having terminals in their house. The idea that everyone could have a personal computer in their pocket, which also was a terminal hooked into a mass computer, but wasn't an individual computer, but was every computer in the world. I mean, I have a server at home that connects to the internet. That's how I broadcast a radio station. That kind of conception didn't even exist back then. So if you're saying, what did we have back then that we should be trying to develop today? The answer is I couldn't even tell you because they didn't know what things were possible today back then. They were thinking in gross terms rather than miniaturization. They just couldn't know. Certainly social extrapolations like equality for everybody. Certainly I'd love to have space travel, but that's not happening anytime soon. Here's a fun little factoid. Elon Musk, current savior of humanity. Inspiration 4 launched into orbit the other day and took 4 people into orbit. It was hailed as bringing space flight to the masses. And what I determined doing a little research was, in fact, SpaceX has reduced the cost of human space travel to orbit since the Gemini years by a factor of 2. 2. Not even an order of magnitude 2. Affordable to any billionaire. And I submit that the spacefaring future where we have moon bases and so forth is not going to happen as long as our paradigm exists of throwing mass out the back end of a cylinder. So what kind of technologies should we pursue? I think we have gross ideas of what we want, but how we're going to get there, we have no idea. And that's the joy of basic research, right? You just keep looking at everything until you find something that works in a way you didn't expect. I mean, artificial dye happened because someone was looking for artificial quinine.
Okay. What contemporary authors do you recommend for a more positive, futuristic sci-fi outlook?
So I'm going to be a little biased here. And the reason I'm going to be a little biased is twofold. One, I spend all my time living in 1966, except when I come out of my hole to talk to you good people, where I have to wear a mask, except right here on stage. I'm a hypocrite and I feel terrible, but I'm also way far from everybody else. So my dance card is full. I actually don't read a lot of modern science fiction, sadly. There's a lot of good stuff back then and a lot of forgotten stuff and a lot of progressive stuff. People feel like anything before 1980 is racist and chauvinist and terrible and all done by white straight men, and that's just not the case. And the other reason I'm biased is I write science fiction. I run a publishing company called Journey Press, press.com. We're coming out with new titles all the time. We reprint lost classics, especially by marginalized authors with marginalized characters about interesting topics, but also by modern people. And one thing we don't do is dark. I don't like dark. I like my futures to be aspirational rather than cautionary. And so I've written the Keetra saga. I've got 2 books in it so far. There'll eventually be 10. At least one of them is available at the Georgia Tech Library and signed as of today. And it's an aspirational future. It takes 800 years from now, and prejudice, gender issues, all that's just not even mentioned. It's not an issue. We are post-worrying about that. Is that realistic? I don't know, but it's the future I want to see. I don't think a lot of people are writing that these days. I know because when I've called bookstores expanding my network and I've said, you'll like Keetra because unlike most YA, it's not dystopian and grimdark, and they always laugh and give a sigh of relief. So I can't give you recommendations. I'm sure they exist. But I can tell you that there's a lot of good, hopeful science fiction back in the 1960s. I strongly recommend Babel 17 by Chip Delaney, Samuel R. Delaney. I strongly recommend I Want the Stars by Tom Purdom, which is amazing. It begins with the idea of Earth is a utopia. Every want is satisfied, including if you want a starship and want to explore the stars. What now? And I think it's such a beautiful, interesting premise. I think Star Trek originally was on that premise. I don't think Star Trek is in that premise now. I think Star Trek has slid into darkness, including the movie Star Trek Into Darkness.
Right. And for those of you who are interested, we will have books available after this from Galactic Journey Press. So stick around. Okay, great. 5th question. Given the idea that the extent of science may plateau as we are no longer capturing the low-hanging fruit, how might science fiction pivot as the rapid progress in the hard sciences from the 20th century slows?
There was a recent president who observed that everything that could be invented has been invented. Everything that could be discovered has been discovered. That was President William McKinley at the end of century before last. And by the way, people believe that. At the end of the 19th century, classical physics had reached its limit, and people thought, that's it. All we're going to do is file the end of the constants. But other than that, we know everything there is to know about the universe. And then 1905 and the photoelectric effect and Einstein, and you had a quantum effect and so forth. That changed everything. You cannot tell me we are on the edge of discovering everything. That is impossible. We didn't even, 55 years ago, continental drift theory was just becoming established. 30 years ago, it was still fashionable to debate evolution. 60 years ago, we didn't know if the universe was expanding from a big bang or was in a steady state situation. The idea that we've discovered everything there is and all that there is left is social science is ridiculous and unsubstantiated. It's easy to get there. You think, well, and we always get here, right? And Thomas Kuhn talked about scientific paradigms. We get to a point where we've reached the limit of our paradigm, phlogiston theory, right? Then all of a sudden someone discovers oxygen and realizes everything's reversed from what we thought, and suddenly you can invent an entire field of chemistry. It feels like we are in overripe situation, right? We have discovered everything there is. We don't know what dark energy is. There's nothing else to discover. That just means we are on the edge of a fundamental discovery that's going to change everything. Hopefully we all live long enough to see it.
So speaking of sort of worries like that, what new fears or predictions do you expect to see told next in science fiction?
Well, something happened last year. Science fiction tends to come from the pages of science, and always tries to stay a step ahead, right? So for 1957, science fiction was planetary science fiction for the most part. There was some starfaring science fiction. For the most part, it was, we're going to go to Mars and see what's there. We're going to go to Venus and see what's there. And as soon as Sputnik went up, the first artificial satellite, all of a sudden, science fiction went to the stars because the planets were old hat. We knew we were going to be to the planets in just a few years. Isaac Asimov stopped writing science fiction in 1957 and switched to science fact, because if you wanted your science fiction, you just read the newspaper. I think it's all about genetics and computers and the singularity. I think there's discussion of AI. I think there are some perennial bugaboos, right? I talked about how a lot of the doomsday scenarios that didn't come to pass could still come to pass. Environmental catastrophe is still out there. Overpopulation is still out there. Nuclear devastation is still out there. Destruction by pandemic is out there. These are all things we have to worry about. Unemployment could be around the corner. There's going to come a point when the population growth no longer sustains an expanding economy. And what does the economy look like when you don't create more and more markets to sustain you? Now, that may get all fixed when we discover faster than light travel and build colonies, because then we have infinite markets. Then we have to get into the moral ramifications of settling the universe, especially if it's not completely uninhabited.
So I want to take a moment and see if I was going to turn it back over to the live audience. It's your turn to talk a little bit, people.
Go ahead.
Ask about the transition of the medium that science fiction comes to. So you've talked a lot about things that are written or some things that were on television, but as time has gone on, it's expanded into film and podcasting and internet sources. Has that affected the way that stories are told or the way that they're being interacted with?
So that's an excellent question. Fundamentally, no. So one of the big arenas that you didn't mention, but is implicit, is games, right? Last year, Detroit or maybe it's 2 years ago now, Detroit Become Human came out, and it was nothing we haven't seen before. I don't know have any of you played DBH, right? Big thumbs up over there. Sentient robots, right? It's something there's been stories about it forever. There was a great one by Lester Del Rey in the recent issue of If, 1966. What happens if you program a robot with Asimov's 3 laws? It turns them into a neurotic. And the only way you can have true equality between AI and human is if you don't program them, you just teach them like a human. But DBH was a first and third person exploration in the 2030s of human AI interaction, right? We've seen the same thing in Blade Runner in the 80s. So the stories are the same. The medium changes, but I don't think the medium has changed so much. I think the main thing you get out of the broadening of media that science fiction has brought to everyone is that more people can encounter it. And that's really exciting because it begins with Star Trek. Before Star Trek, the original Star Trek, science fiction was the province of a few thousand propeller head beanie people who would go to conventions every year, get drunk and write stuff. Star Trek beamed into 40 million homes every week, and a few million people watched it. And as a result, it became mainstream. And the ideas in Star Trek were not were not revolutionary, right? These were all things that we had seen in print science fiction for decades. But they were new to the people watching them who had never encountered them before. They were new to demographics that had never seen them before. Star Trek, in many ways, is the point of inflection where women become part of the science fiction community. It's not the only reason. It's hand in hand with the second wave of feminism. Nevertheless, women became fan fiction writers and then became professional writers. Women started writing scripts for Star Trek, and their careers got launched as a result of that. So as you get more media science fiction, I don't think the stories change very much, but the audiences you can reach becomes broader. And the way you can tell those stories becomes more interesting and complex.
Do we have any more live questions?
Dude.
Great.
Hi. Is it on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, like you, I really like optimistic, aspirational science fiction. Huge Trekkie over here. So I'm wondering, do you have any, I know you said that you don't watch a lot of contemporary, or you don't read a lot of contemporary stuff, but of the contemporary stuff that you have read or seen, is there any aspirational, optimistic science fiction that you would recommend? If not, from the past, what would you recommend?
So I do manage to keep abreast of modern television. I would say that The Expanse is the closest thing to hard science fiction we've had on television since the first season of Babylon 5 and the original Star Trek. And I'm gonna make an assertion that people may disagree with. A lot of people like to say that the original Star Trek was hokey, campy, stupid, wrong, whatever. Star Trek, the original, is the only Star Trek franchise that for its time was actual science fiction, I would submit. Even more than Next Gen or anything that came after that. The ones after that, they might be good television, they might be good shows, they might have good writing, they might have good actors. Big fan of Sir Patrick Stewart. Big fan of everybody. But he is a Sir, right? Okay. I know Sir Ian McKellen, his buddy is. But Star Trek was rooted in the science of the time. And one of the things that I loved about The Expanse, aside from the fact that its creators and I were on the Hugo ballot in the same year, I was on the panel at Worldcon with one of the creators, and I'd completely forgotten who he was and that I'd met him. But to be fair, he'd forgotten who I was too, so it was okay. The first 3 seasons in particular, I have not read the books, and I would say that the 4th and the 5th seasons lean more into dystopic, which is a shame. But the first 3 seasons of The Expanse, I think, are actually quite hopeful, because they're all about Earth and Mars and the Belt, who have had a Cold War for the past 100 years, getting together to face and deal with this extraterrestrial, I won't even say threat exactly, but opportunity and potential hazard. I really dug that, and the Avasarala character was just the coolest character ever. She's the assistant undersecretary for the UN, and essentially the power behind the throne. And there's a lot of real politics and whatever, but underneath it all, there was a hopeful message to me, an incredible aspirational demographics and acceptance of gender and ethnicity and so forth. So strongly recommend the first 3 seasons of The Expanse. Hard for me to recommend the 4th season. The 5th season is just okay. Maybe they'll stick the landing on the 6th season. It hasn't come out yet.
Any more live questions?
So in 1966, music is getting psychedelic. And I know that Hawkwind is coming in 1970, but is music getting science fictional yet? Are you seeing that kind of crossover?
The way that science fiction and music are interacting at the time. It's interesting you say psychedelic. Drugs are becoming enough a part of the culture in 1960 that they're starting to be made illegal. In February 1966, the federal government banned LSD. In October 6th, so just last week from my perspective, California became the first state to ban the use of LSD. So people had to go to Mexico or to Canada to do it. Music is starting to become trippy. And where it's interfacing with science fiction is not in subject matter yet. That's going to happen in the late 60s, early 70s, partly buoyed by the fact that Lord of the Rings is going to become huge. I actually want to talk about that in just a second because people draw the wrong lesson from how Lord of the Rings became popular. In terms of science fiction and music interacting, it's just in terms of sounds. For 1960s, the theremin. Seen the theremin? It's a touchless electromagnetic instrument. It's amazing. It was used for science fiction film music. In 1966, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys incorporates it in a pop song for the first time. If you ever listen to anyone watch Doctor Who, the original Doctor Who theme, which still gets sampled today, which is pretty amazing 60 years later. We cover Doctor Who, by the way. We have a British correspondent just for that in Galactic Journey. The original Doctor Who theme is a miracle of sound effects and tapes spliced together and weird electronic circuits and everything. That sort of mechanical sound sounded like science. So the soundscape is science fiction, but not the topics yet. I wanted to bring up Lord of the Rings real quick because it is a cultural touchstone. Everyone has seen the movies. Probably everyone has read the books. That would not have happened except for a quirk of the publishing industry. If you ask anyone, why did Lord of the Rings become so popular? And people say, oh, well, you know, it's because it resonated with the hippie phenomenon of the 60s. You know, this going back to a more primitive life and the simplistic hobbits. No. It happened in 1965 because Donald Wollheim, the publisher of Ace, figured that the books had gone into the public domain in the United States and decided to come out with a paperback edition where none had existed before. Before 1965, Lord of the Rings was too expensive for people to read. 8,000 people had bought books. 8,000 out of the world. And that was Tolkien's fault. He didn't want his stuff debased by coming out in paperback edition. So it came out in paperback, and suddenly everybody was reading Lord of the Rings. And then Tolkien sued. And then Ace said, would you like $8,000, which was a lot of money back then. And Tolkien said, yes, I would. And I'll also now come out with a paperback version. And that's the versions a lot of us have read. And Lord of the Rings coming to the fore, and famed female science fiction editor Sel Goldsmith, who we just did an article about, and nobody knows who that is except Lisa and me. She resurrected fantasy. It was a dead genre till she brought it back in the pages of Fantastic in the early 60s. And then in the late 60s, we had Led Zeppelin and other bands taking Lord of the Rings and all these other. You had Michael Moorcock writing songs for Blue Oyster Cult, and then you truly had the union of science fiction fantasy music. And by the way, just a quick plug: the coolest thing about running the Galactic Journey is occasionally the people we write about are still alive and will comment. So we've been talking about Michael Moorcock. Everyone know who Michael Moorcock is? Big fantasy author from the 60s. He's still around, and he edited magazines. He commented on one of our articles the other day. Anyway, sorry. I went on forever.
No, that's good. And my students, you better be shaking your heads and knowing who Michael Moorcock is. We really just went over that recently. Okay, great. Gosh, we have so many questions here. It's crazy.
I have all day. I'll leave when you want me to.
Great. I think we have about 10 more minutes, so we'll be taking questions. Absolutely.
You can also ask me. You can go to Galactic Journey. You can send me an email. I have endless time and no friends.
And for people who are a little bit further down on the question queue from the digital audience, you may want to do that. I'm not sure we're going to get to everything here, though. We've got some fantastic questions. All right, so here comes Foundation. You knew this was happening. Regarding the recent TV series Foundation, what would be your comment on the epistemic? Oh, shoot, I just got a new question and I lost my place.
On the answer
epistemic change, that caused the developments in the soft sciences like sociology and ethics or the current inclusivity. Are there other reasons, or are there other reasons?
You mean, can I draw a line between Foundation and sociology?
I think that's what the question is asking. Because right, this is the sort of in the moment when science fiction is beginning to shift from just the hard sciences to the soft sciences, and Foundation's playing with that.
Maybe. I mean, remember, Foundation was actually based on Toynbee's Decline of the Roman Empire. Asimov had just read it and thought he should turn that into a science fiction story, and then he created psychohistory, which makes no sense at all. This idea that you can predict I mean, I guess there's some value to psychohistory, right? If you make the sample size large enough, then everything becomes statistics, regardless of the individuals in it. That said, you can't predict everything, and I guess the mule is the whole wrench in it, right? I would have trouble saying that foundation is the base of sociology becoming of accepted science, especially since Toynbee ultimately got invalidated shortly after foundation was written. But it is true that there is a relation between the softer sciences and science fiction of the 50s and 60s, where people started to explore the human condition and the interaction of science and society, rather than just what technology would do for people. But I don't know that I would list foundation as the turning point.
Good to know. All right. Here's our 8th question. Are we willing to stop global warming?
I am.
All right.
I've stopped raising cattle in my backyard. No, absolutely. And one great thing about humanity is we have the ability to avert catastrophe right when we get close to it, especially when it becomes an economic interest. And as James Burke once said in his wonderful series Connections, and if you haven't seen it, please watch it, late 70s Connections, amazing series. This wasn't just costing lives, it was costing money. And as we speak, insurance companies are charging more to build in floodplains and other places where climatic emergencies are happening. And so you can bet all of a sudden, as soon as it costs more to do business, all of a sudden the conservative elements are going to be behind fixing these issues. There's a reason why the Navy has been ahead of the curve on global warming. They know their port facilities are going to flood in the next 20 years, and they don't want that to happen. So do I think we're going to avert global warming? Not without a lot of pain, and a lot of pain that's going to happen to people that aren't us, right? When you look at a macro scale, 100 years from now, if we don't avert global warming, the planet's going to be okay. Canada's going to be okay. Russia's going to be okay. There will be more farmable land on Earth than there is now. Well, it might be a net gain, but are we willing to lose the quadrillions of dollars and the billions of lives just to get to that end state? I don't think so. I think we have a vested interest in keeping our planet where it is, where we know it should be, where the equilibrium is.
I think it's great that you're talking about climate change, because we actually have a number of questions circling around that. I think you've hit a lot of what people are asking, but 2 specific questions that I'm seeing here is, should we all be writing to our politicians now, and as much as is humanly possible, to get them thinking more about climate change? And then, what is some science fiction from either of your contemporary periods that might help us think through these issues from different perspectives?
Boy, okay. So what's cool is I've known a lot of politicians, and I've known a lot of people who work for politicians. Writing to them, okay, it's always worth it to write your congressman, because so few people do. And from what I understand, each letter represents 1,000 constituents in the eyes of a congressperson. So it's always a good idea to do it. That said, when you pick big ticket items, chances are they'll ignore it. If you see it on Twitter and you get really mad about it and you write to your congressman about it, they'll throw it away. Because everybody's writing about it. On the other hand, if it's 2018 and you write to your congressman and say, I'm really concerned about the public domain being extended another 20 years, they might read that one because nobody else is talking about it. A lot of people aren't talking about that. I'm not going to say who wrote that letter. So yes, it's important to talk to your politicians. And some would argue that climate change is in fact the most important issue facing the world today. But it's really hard to get that traction when there are so many things that are immediately killing people or disadvantaging people, right? And there's a whole lot of things. And you can get paralysis, right? How can I worry about this thing that's still 20 years in the future when people are dying right now, when trans people are being discriminated against right now, when people are dying in a pandemic right now? Can I worry about something 20 years down the road? On the other hand, there's the other philosophy. Should I worry about these objectively smaller things when the entire Earth is at stake? As for science fiction dealing with changing things, I'll have to get back to you. It's hard for me to think on top of my head great examples of changing the world through politics, although one of the very first environmental science fiction that I can think of is Death World by Harry Harrison, where you've got a planet. Anyone read Death World by Harry Harrison? One person. It's a really good book. Came out in 1960. It's actually public domain. You can read it on Gutenberg. And the premise is there is a planet where the colonists are at war with the planet, and the planet's ecology keeps finding more and more ways to exterminate the humans on this planet. And there's sort of this arms race between the colonists and the ecosystem. And it turns out it wasn't always this way. What happened was the ecosystem was reacting to the colonists not living in harmony with the ecosystem. And there's actually colonists that left the cities and are living in harmony with this ecosystem and not being attacked by it. And that's a bit of a veiled message. It's not on the nose, but it's definitely an environmentalist message, and it came out in 19.
So we are wrapping up, I believe, at 12:15. So we have time for one last question. And I'm going to go ahead and take one from our live audience then. Go ahead. Got a microphone coming your way.
Like in modern times, it's been kind of popular for like the condemnation of like past historical figures who maybe didn't have the most progressive viewpoints. Like, what would you think about like the condemnation of authors such as H.P. Lovecraft or John W. Campbell, who had, you know, less great social viewpoints?
So those are two great people to bring up, and I'll stick to them for now. I will say the value of Galactic Journey is appreciating things in context, because people were both more and less progressive back then than we think. These ideas of equality and progress, they existed back then, and people were fighting for them for decades before then. And someone once said, "Aren't you kind of an anachronism fighting for these progressive issues in 1960?" I'm like, I may be further at one end of the bell curve, but these things existed. They had to stand on the shoulders of other things. So H.P. Lovecraft gets a bad rep because he's seen as racist, anti-Semitic, although he actually married a Jewish person. And he was, and perhaps even more so than was de rigueur for the time, but probably not much more so. A lot of the stuff was in the air, but doesn't make it forgivable. And that said, you can't say that of everyone. Like, so Dorothy Sayers, mystery author, did not write anti-Semitic stuff. But who's the Marjorie Allingham? Right. So Agatha Christie, Marjorie Allingham, you can't look at them and say, well, it was the time, because obviously it wasn't just the time, because there were people being progressive. John W. Campbell. So it has become very fashionable to specifically beat up on him. And by the way, people have been beating up on him since the 30s. Fred Pohl was beating up on him. I've been beating up on him for a long time. People have been beating up from him long before Jeanette Ng, who's a very nice person, and I love her very much, but before she said that he was an effing fascist, right? She was the crystallizing moment, and then the Astounding Award, the Campbell Award became the Astounding Award. But people have known what Campbell was for a very long time. Campbell was a kook. He believed in the natural superiority of some people to others. He was famously cantankerous. He was a jerk. He also was in many ways responsible for the ushering in of modern science fiction in the 40s. He was also responsible for a lot of women's science fiction coming to the fore under their own names, from Catherine MacLean to Pauline Ashwell. If you look in the pages of Unknown, which is the fantastic sister magazine to Astounding in the 1930s and 40s, there were at least 9 women published there who didn't get published anywhere else, for the most part. John Campbell has a lot of problems, no question. But the idea that John Campbell represented everything that was wrong and that we've somehow surpassed him is ludicrous. The idea of making John Campbell this poster boy of everything that was science fiction back in the 40s and 50s really does a disservice to people like L. Goldsmith and H.L. Gold and other people who were being progressive. Tony Boucher of F&SF especially. F&SF was publishing lots and lots of women in its pages long before everyone else was. So yeah, you have to look at it in context. You don't give any excuses because people knew what racism was back then. People knew what chauvinism was back then. But it was also the air people breathed. So there's an unconscious chauvinism. Let's face it, I did not reach my wokeness until, say, 2011, when my wife went before the creators of DC Comics and said, where are the women creators and where are the women characters? And that was her Jeanette Ng moment. She was not the only one fighting for female representation in DC Comics, but she was the tip of the spear. And as a result, DC Comics changed over the next several years. That was my wife. And it wasn't until 2011 that, I'd always considered myself a feminist, and equality and everything, and I wasn't an out-and-out racist or chauvinist until then, but it wasn't until then that I realized, Bechdel-Wallace test. So you have to cut a little slack, but not too much. That's my long-winded answer.
All right, I want to thank everyone again for being here with us today, and let's all thank Gideon Marcus for an amazing hour and a half.
Thank you to our virtual audiences. We're so pleased to have you. Today's event was put on through the Georgia Tech Library Public Programming Initiative. It is part of a series for 50 years of science fiction at Georgia Tech, so please come see our exhibit, come to our future events. If you go to the Georgia Tech Library website and you go to our events, you'll find more science fiction events in the coming months. Have a great day. Bye.